Hello and welcome to Life is a Scale Model. If you're not already a subscriber, please subscribe and hit the like button. We're trying to get to 100 subs before the end of the year, and your support would really help us out in that endeavor. Today we're going to be continuing our Enterprise A project, and we're going to move from construction to filling some gaps and sanding some things and then putting some paint on there. So our first step is going to be putting down a primer coat. This is not going to be our final primer coat. We're actually adding an intermediate step here. Since we're going to be getting into some bigger models after this, we're going to need to start altering our workflow ever so slightly. And so this primer coat is actually for us to take a look at the model and pick out any imperfections. It's just supposed to help us see those a bit more easily so that we can then take care of them and try to work them out so that they're not visible anymore. You can see there's still a little gap on the strong back there, and we have a fairly noticeable gap on the deflector housing, as well as some pretty messy filler on the warp nacelle pylon. So those are things we're going to work on. Taking the model off the stand, it just makes it a little easier for me to articulate it. I've got my putty knife. We're going to be using my Tamiya white putty at this point in the project. It has a number of benefits when sanding. Primarily, it doesn't shrink. I do like the Vallejo. It's really good, like I said previously, in certain applications, but I did notice it did shrink a little bit after I'd worked with it previously on this model, where the Tamiya is a bit better about not freezing. So right now, just to kind of prep for filler, I'm sanding down some of the seams on the model that I can see. We'll try to get those seams as flush as we can this time around and really try to knock this model out of the park. Broke woodworking rule there just now. Sanding with the grain. You're supposed to sand with the grain. I've been sanding against the grain on the model. I find it's quicker and a little bit more efficient to sand perpendicular to the seam on the model. I don't know that it makes much difference, but I just see results a lot more quickly that way. And now on to the Tamiya putty. I don't know the exact name of the type of putty knife I'm using. I just know that it's rounded and it's wide. And since it's wide and rounded, it's really good for like pushing filler into little crevices and things. And so I'm going to start working around that deflector housing. I'm going to try to get that deflector housing to blend with the rest of the model as well as I can. If we fill and sand and get rid of those seam lines that are created by the various parts of the model that we put together, it really helps to sell the illusion that this object is less of a toy and more of the thing it's supposed to represent in real life. So that's why we're going to be a little bit more anal retentive about this step in this build. And we're just going to try to get rid of as many join points and seam lines as we possibly can. Probably would have been nice to do this before I put the saucer on. It would have given me a bit better and a bit easier access. But what's done is done. So now I'm going to move on from the deflector housing, and I'm going to move to the other side. I forgot that I had done that. That is totally my bad. But I do like to work in sections, and if you've watched me before, I tend to get into routines of starting decals a particular way, or starting filling particular way. If you can get yourself into certain routines, then you don't have to put as much thought into, okay, what do I have to do next? You start to develop a bit of a workflow, and that can certainly speed up the process of model building. I wouldn't recommend you do it to the extent that you start cutting corners or forgetting steps or whatever, but having a basic workflow figured out definitely will be helpful in the model building process. I'm working with my files to sand down those warp nacelles a little bit. They've got terrible seam lines. I don't care which version of the Enterprise you happen to be building a model of in 2500 scale. They all just have terrible seam lines. But that's what sandpaper is for. So I'm going to move on now and try to patch up that seam on the, they call it the strong back area of the Enterprise refit, or the Constitution refit if you want to be a little bit more specific. Again, this is where the warp nacelle pylons sandwiched between the two halves of the engineering hull. And my Vallejo filler did a wonderful job there, but then it shrank a little bit. So we're gonna just put some Vallejo in there, and it's not as clean and easy as we're gonna put some Tamiya in there, and it's not as clean and easy as the Vallejo, but we should get some pretty good results after we do some sanding. It'll help to erase those join lines. So we're just filling around those join lines. I'm using the tip of that putty knife to push some of that filler into that gap. I want to get everything good and filled so that when it dries and I sand it, I'll get a nice seamless look. I didn't think I was going to do this step because once I got the model glued together, everything looked okay, but as much as I tried to rationalize, oh, that's where the ship would separate if they had to do a saucer separation, I just couldn't do it. So here we are with my Tamiya white, filling the seam lines along the saucer section and the neck of the ship. This is something I definitely would have done with Vallejo if I had done it before I put the primer coat on, but at this point I was like, we'll just go ahead and do it with the filler we're using, and all of the headache of sanding will be future my problem. I did try as much as possible to to not use too much filler there. If you can get in there and fill your seams with just a tiny bit of filler and it'll do the job, that's definitely preferable to glopping filler all over the place. Because if you glop it all over the place, then of course you're either going to have to wipe it off before it dries and run the risk of taking filler out of your seam, or else you're going to have to wait till it dries and sand it off, which can be a bit of a headache. So be judicious with your filler. Boy, from that angle, you can see I really wasn't judicious with the filler around the deflector housing. Do as I say, not as I do, I guess. Now you can see I've got the ship laying upside down as I sand the bottoms of the warp nacelles here. Obviously that makes sense because I'm sanding the bottom of the warp nacelles, but also I'm pushing it just slightly down against the table, and what that does is it keeps the model from flexing the warp nacelle pylons a little bit. I can't stress enough how delicate those warp nacelle pylons are. If you happen to be visiting the channel and you've worked with the refit enterprise in larger scales like the 1/1000 or especially the 1/350, those larger scale models, people I've chatted with online and whatnot say, you know, you have to reinforce those pylons because they're so narrow and delicate that if you don't, then over time they will gradually flex and bend, and eventually they will start to sag. And so that's the kind of delicate material we're dealing with here. I actually have two of these models that I built probably a decade or so ago where a nacelle has snapped off of the model at the pylon. I've not yet come up with a solution to fix these breaks, but who knows, maybe I'll take a stab at it sometime in the future. Now we moved on from filling our seams, and now we're going to start sanding. This is another one where I will advise you to do as I say, not as I do. I tend to be one of those people that will reuse sandpaper until it's absolutely devoid of grit. Don't ask me why. I get pieces folded and contorted into shapes that work for me, and I tend to stick with until they just completely give up life. So the piece of sandpaper I'm using right now, I've probably been using for, I don't know, it could have been 6 months or more. But it still has grit and it still sands for me. So I'll keep on using it. You'll watch me, I'll run it across the paper towel there. That's to get material out from between the pieces of grit that are on the sandpaper so the sandpaper can actually still do its job. There is another alternative if you don't want to, be janky like I am. You can also use wet dry sandpaper. I do not have experience with it, but I'm told that it is the bee's knees in a lot of situations. And really, the difference is when you're using wet sandpaper and you're doing a wet sand, it doesn't produce as much dust, and also the water getting circulated around as you sand helps keep the grit on the sandpaper clear so that you're not getting buildup of debris and material in between your grit, and so it tends to be a lot more efficient. We will probably get to that at some point once I learn that skill, but for now we're going to stick to what I know, which is using janky old pieces of sandpaper that I've been using for months because they get the job done. And if they get the job done, then and you're happy with the results, then there's no reason to fret. You just do you. Ultimately, the purpose of the modeling hobby is to build something that you can be happy with and proud of, and that expresses your vision for the subject. So now I'm using my file here. I realized as I was doing this particular project, I probably need to soak my files in some warm dishwater or something, try to loosen up some of the crud that's gotten trapped in those things over the years, because they're not sanding as well as I would like, and I didn't want to take the extreme measure of stepping up onto my diamond tip files, because those will chew through everything in no time flat. And the the name of the game here is to be gentle and slow and methodical. We want to get all that excess filler material off the model, obviously, but we don't want to take any of the actual model uh, away as we're doing that. If we do that, we're going to end up with little dings that maybe don't look so great. So I'm trying to work my sandpaper in my files and get as much of that material as I can. Um, I need to make an apology at this point. I think in a few previous episodes I mentioned that my happy place for sandpaper grit was 60 grit, and as you're gonna see in a few minutes, it's actually 150 grit. So I do apologize if anyone went by my advice there and used 60 grit sandpaper only to realize that it was really heavy grit, because that would be really heavy grit and it would definitely chew through a model super duper bad. Um, just as a general point of reference there, 150 is my happy medium grit. It had just been so long since I had actually looked at the paper that I didn't realize I was leading y'all astray. So now again, I'm working with a square file here. It's a little narrower than a flat file, and so uh, it gets in between that neck and those nacelles a little bit more nice than say a flat file would. That's a little bit wider. You're going to see me use a whole different slew of files today, because this refit Constitution class has a lot of unique angles and curves, and it just makes it it just makes it a challenge to sand. But now I'm back to sandpaper because the file just wasn't cutting it, and you can see why the file isn't cutting it. Like I said, I need to soak my files in some warm soapy water and get them cleaned up a bit. And back to the file. It may not have a lot going for it, but it is pretty good for getting into those little nooks and crannies where two pieces meet kind of at a perpendicular. And yes, it's a boring process here, but this is kind of the less than uh, glamorous side of building models. I tend to try to minimize this particular portion of the model building process as much as I can, but this is just the reality when it comes to building scale models. Is sometimes you just spend a lot of time sanding and filling and sanding and filling. For demonstrative purposes, I did the one coat of primer, and then I did the filling and the sanding, and then I moved on. But I'm sure that there are far more experienced and talented model builders out there who repeat this process several times in order to get that absolutely perfect finish and that absolutely perfect look. And for sure, if you're looking to get into modeling and do some competitive stuff with like the International Plastic Modeler Society or whatever, then you're going to want to start doing that kind of process yourself. I've once been to a model competition, and I was just astounded by the level of craftsmanship that went into some of those models. I thought I was pretty good, but looking at some of the competitive models that were on display, I was just blown away. Here I am, back to sanding seam lines. At least my ADHD didn't take me to a completely different part of the model. I'm still somewhere near the deflector housing. I'll say I do have one gripe with the design of this model kit, and it has more to do with the stand than with the model itself. The kit, once you get it built up, as you saw if you watched the motion picture refit enterprise bill I did previously, looks just fantastic. But that little hole there that you put the stand in is right along the seam line of the engineering hull. And so if you accidentally, jab that stand in a little too hard, you could split that seam. I don't know what round 2 would necessarily do about that, because honestly, that's the most practical place to put that thing. But it's just something I noticed as I was working. It's also a bit of a wider hull than I noticed on the TOS Enterprise model kit. It sits a lot lower on the stand. That's just something to be aware of if you're not doing any custom display bases or anything like that, and you're just going to use the dome stands that come with the model kits. Just be aware of that. Don't let your kid pound on the thing like a button or whatever, or be too rough when you're placing them on the stand props, because you could split the model there, and that would be sad. So now I'm working the deflector housing, but I'm paying particular attention to just some flare that exists on the whole surface. And I'm just trying to get the filler putty sanded down without, as much as possible, without damaging any of the flares that have been built into that model. As much as possible, we want the details that are included on the model to look crisp. And the best way to achieve that is to not sand things into oblivion. So I'm being very gentle, very careful, trying to work in between those things and work around them as much as I can without taking anything off the actual model surface itself. This is the part of the process where you need to be patient, and you need to kind of constantly double check yourself as you're working, so that you don't accidentally goof. It is kind of hard um, to get in there and see what you're doing, especially when you're fighting with not getting your bombastic hair in the middle of the shot and blocking the shot, or pulling the model itself out of frame. It's the tug of war that I gladly do for you guys, trying to figure that whole mess out. I think I'm getting better. But here we are. Here's my 150 grit sandpaper. This is probably the first piece I've cut maybe in a year. I wanted a sand stick, but I needed something that was more narrow than what I already had, so that I could get into that area between the photon torpedo launcher and the saucer. and what I had was about the exact width of that space, and it just didn't give me what I needed in order to get in there and sand the way that I wanted. So here we are with a more narrow sandpaper stick and out of frame. I apologize, as I just started patting myself on the back for improving. There we go. But you can see I can get in there a lot easier with that sandpaper stick than I could previously. That was a jerky movement. That was me consciously realizing, oh, I'm not in frame, and quickly course correcting. So the primer layer I found as I was doing this process really helps me to differentiate the filler from the model. And what I'm talking about is the primer and the filler are both white, but they are slightly different shades of white, and they're slightly different. What's the word? They're slightly different levels of shiny, for lack of a better way of putting it. Lusters. That's the word I was looking for. And so it adds a little bit of contrast. And full disclosure, this is the first time I've added this step to a model build ever in my life. But I'd been thinking for a few days about how I might make this second video in the series a little bit longer, because when I built the motion picture version of the refit Constitution, the second video ended up being like 13 minutes long. And what I have found as a general rule of thumb with my view numbers is that the longer the video is, the more people tend to like to watch them. And so I was trying to figure out a way that I might add some length to this video without doing something absolutely unnecessary, and this is the solution I came up with. As Captain Spock asked in the saddest cinematic moment in history, what do you think of my solution? Let me know in the comments. As you can see, we're going to struggle bus through sanding the strongback area, because there's a ridge that runs down the center of it that we don't want to sand away. But also, we're working around the warp nacelle pylons, and they are curvy, and we're also working between the neck and the warp nacelle pylons and the saucer. It could be very easy to get neglectful here, so just pay attention to how you're handling the model and what you're sanding and where you're sanding, so that you don't make a goof and make yourself unhappy. But definitely getting into the base of the pylons is tough. Figure it out best you can. Do whatever you find that works. Just take your time. The thing I have to repeat to myself often is it's not a race to get it all done. Although with these builds I do have to have them done within the time frame to get my videos published, so there's that. But for you at home, there's no race. You just do things at your own pace. It doesn't matter if a model takes you a week or a month or a year. or even longer than that. As long as you achieve the results that you set out to achieve or close to it, and you're happy with those results, that's the most important thing. So now I'm just looking at this massive blob of filler and wondering to myself, okay, what do I do next? Where do I go? I definitely made a lot more work for myself than needed to be done. We won't be revisiting this model anytime in the near future like we've done here. Um, we're going to be moving on to subsequent enterprises in the series. But I will forever remember this model kit as the one where I need to find a better way to fill the seams at the strong back area. Probably I need a more precise tool and less filler putty. So now we're going back to the files. This is a diamond tip file, not in the sense that it has diamonds on the tip like my actual diamond tip files, but the file itself is shaped like a diamond on a face card or playing card. Why was I using that one? Well, because it's got some really thin angles at the edges, but also, you may have noticed, I have rarely used it, so it's not gummed up with stuff from previous model builds. I call this one the wedge because it's got what you would expect to see with like a normal flat tip file on one side, and then on the other it's wedged. It's kind of like a samurai sword. You can see from all of the collected debris that's in the file grit that I have used this one extensively over the years. It's really good for getting into tiny nooks and crannies. Uh, this one, I got nothing. It's kind of triangle shape, except it doesn't have a sharp tip like some of the triangle shaped ones that I have do. And again, I was using it because it was clean and it would make slightly quicker uh, progress than my not clean files. But now we're back to good old-fashioned sandpaper. I'm just trying to get in between that pylon and the surface of the model with my thumb to get some of that excess filler out of there. And again, I think more precise tools would have made this job slightly easier. I've got a really tiny knife, and on the other end of that putty knife that I was using that may have been slightly better suited to this particular part of the project for not being so bulky and unwieldy. But you can see I'm just toiling away, switching between sandpaper and files. I'm kind of feeling my way through this. And I'd like to say that as you get experience, this part might go a little bit more efficiently. I can't vouch for that because every build is different. But it's one of those things where you can create in your mind a a certain bit of general process guides maybe, and then you can speed things up a little bit here and there. But it's one of those steps you really don't want to go too fast, because if you do, you could goof and wreck your model. So yeah, we're just looking at this thing from every angle, and I'm scrutinizing super duper hard here, trying to make sure that I get all the stuff that isn't supposed to be there off the model. Now I'm working on the area where I accidentally cut a bit of model off the model itself when I was cutting the injection point off with my hobby knife. Just trying to blend that with the rest of the model the best I can. If you would like to experience that goof, I highly recommend you watch part 1 of this build tutorial. You can kind of tell I'm getting towards the end of the process here, because now I'm not so fixated on parts that I filled. Now I'm looking for seam lines and things to clean up to try to make the model look its best. And that's, again, just part of the process. You just scrutinize and scrutinize and fill and sand and fill and sand until you're happy. Or don't. I mean, if you're brand new to the hobby and you don't feel like you're comfortable doing that yet, it's not something that's absolutely necessary. The level of buy-in is going to vary depending on each person. Some people are going to want to be perfectionists about making their models look absolutely spectacular, and some people are going to be happy just kind of, gluing things together and putting on a little paint and a little decal action, and they're going to be happy with that. There was a time when all I could do was glue a model together and put on a little paint and throw on some decals. And 9 times out of 10, I didn't do a great job with the decals, because working with water slide decals takes practice. So I just learned to be happy with the results that I could achieve, and resolved to improve my abilities to where I am today. And if that's something you want to do, I say go for it. But you don't need to feel like you're not as good as somebody else doing the hobby simply because you don't get those spectacular results. We can't all be Bill Krause. He's amazing. If you haven't seen his work, I highly recommend you do a Google search for Bill Krause's work, because he's done some amazing projects over the years. So we're back to the samurai file. We're just getting the last little remnants of putty cleaned up, and getting the last little bit of the seams cleaned up. Now I'm back to my square file. I realized, where there's a really garish looking seam on the model? The shuttle bay doors. It's not an area I pay a lot of attention to, because even though the instructions say to paint them silver, I just never felt like that was something I wanted to do with them. And there aren't any decals to go on them, so it's just kind of an area that gets forgotten in my world. and so I end up with ugly, garish looking seams there. But not today. Today I remembered to file down the seam. But yeah, now I'm going to take that square file that's nice and narrow, and of course it's got square edges-ish, and I'm going to just try to clean up as best I can those raised areas along the deflector housing, and of course my neck area where it joins with the saucer. And I'm filing the seam line where the two halves of the neck met there at the back, just to make sure there isn't a seam line there. And at this juncture, I'm calling it good. That's me standing up. So our next step is going to be to put on another coat of primer. The coat of primer that I did previously was real thin. In fact, you only had to run over the surface of the bottle once to get from primer to plastic. And the reason for that is we didn't want the primer filling in any of the imperfections in the kit itself. So that was a little bit heavier. Now we're going to use this pure white as a base coat. I do apologize for having the model a little bit higher in the frame there than I usually do. I was working around bouts of thunderstorms and the humidity was crazy, so I was just trying to get things done as quickly as I could. But pay attention as I'm painting. You'll see I'm doing little U-shapes. That's to help get good coverage on the model. And so now we're going to get in here and we're going to do the detail painting. I have thoughts about the detail painting, especially because there isn't a whole lot to be done on this model, believe it or not. The wallpaper decals that they provide do a spectacular job. They are just amazing with how much detail they can add to the surface of the model. But there are a few things that you're going to want to paint. And as with the motion picture refit Enterprise, I'm doing titanium silver for the sensor dome there on the bottom. And I will use titanium gold for the bridge dome. And then I found a Warpainter blue that I liked for the impulse crystal. And I'm going to use some German gray for the Bussard collectors on the inside of the warp nacelles, and I'm going to use some copper for the Bussard collectors on the outside of the warp nacelles. And then I'm going to use that German gray. I'm going to try to recreate the lines that go along the front of the warp nacelles. And that is where I've got a little bit of an issue with the painting process of this particular kit. Because I spent months upon months researching for this particular series, I stumbled across a nice little site called JT Graphics, who happens to do aftermarket decals for the 1/2500 scale Star Trek ships, or at least some of them. And for a fee of about $15, you can get his Constitution class refit decals, which, as I was looking closely at them, actually include the darker areas on the front and top of the warp nacelles. Not something that I expected to find, but it exists. And what's really cool is you can actually use the library to make it either the regular refit NCC 1701 or the 1701A. And it even includes decals for the backside of the warp nacelles. That's one area where I noticed that round 2 didn't pay a whole lot of attention with this release. You'll see in the next videos we're doing the decals. They've got these fantastic looking decals for the saucer that proudly display the livery NCC 1701A, but the decals for the warp nacelles are just regular 1701. Alright, so here's my blue. I promise there's a purpose to this. This is, again, I think this is Army Painter brand or Warpaints or something. I found it at a local game store down the street. What am I doing? I'm going to use this thinner medium to thin it just a smidge. Why am I doing that? Well, because I'm using an Army Painter Insane Detail brush that's got, I think, probably a 0.5 tip to it, or 5.0, however they delineate that. And if the paint is really thick, I've noticed that it has a tendency to propagate kind of in the center area of the brush. So if you thin it out, that allows the paint to disperse a little bit more evenly throughout the brush bristles, which makes painting a lot easier. And so I've started just doing that with like my Vallejo paints, because Vallejo paints are nice, but they're pretty thick. And I've just had a lot of good experiences with the coverage and the coat that I get, like the smoothness of the coat, when I use the medium thinner, or the thinner medium, sorry. And so if you happen to be working with thicker paints that are water-based acrylic, I highly recommend picking up some of that thinner medium, because it really makes a huge difference in how well your paint's going to go on your model. Pretty sure I found mine at Hobby Lobby. If you don't have a Hobby Lobby, you can probably find it Hobby Town. Any well-equipped hobby store is probably going to have it. Otherwise, I'm sure you can get it off of Amazon. So now we got the Impulse Crystal painted, and through the magic of editing, we did everything. And you can see I did a really sloppy job with those stripes on the warp nacelles. That's what I'm talking about. JT Graphics, saving your bacon if you want to have the most accurate Constitution refit you can get, and not have to paint the stripes on the warp nacelles, because don't those just look awful? But we're not too concerned, because unlike the motion picture version of this ship that we did previously, the base coat for this one was just white. And white paint is available from every company under the sun. It's a dime a dozen. And it just so happens that in my stash of old paints, I had some Tamiya flat white acrylic. So that's what I'm using. Sometimes I use Vallejo instead. Even though it's thicker, I think it's got a slightly higher pigmentation ratio, so it covers with less coats. I did have to do 2 coats to get the kind of coverage I wanted with the Tamiya paint, and probably I could have stood to do 3 coats, but I was pressed for time, and the weather was not cooperating with me nearly as much as I would have preferred. But save yourself a headache if you want to include this detail on your Enterprise refit or Enterprise A model, and spend $15 at JT Graphics to get yourself some decals. Decals are here. They exist for a reason, and they are wonderful. And I will put a link to the JT decals 2500 series of decals in the description, as well as the paint codes and whatnot for the paints that I used. So check the description if you want to get further information about that. But yes, here we are, touching everything up. You may be asking, well, why didn't you show yourself doing the other detail painting? The answer to that question is kind of simple, and if you've been with the channel for a little while, you probably already know the answer. But my hair got in the way. I had an entire segment, number of minutes long, and the entire segment was nothing but me with my hair covering what I was painting in the frame, and you couldn't see what I was actually doing, and it was frustrating. And I did do some detail painting off camera because I've noticed that there are certain aspects of detail painting that are just easier to do when I can do what I'm doing right now and just kind of get in there and get real close to what I'm painting. And I know y'all don't come here to stare at the back of my head, so I definitely try to keep that to a bare minimum as much as I can. But in this case, you could kind of see in between bouts of painting what was going on. Basically, all I'm doing is I'm looking for paint where it's not supposed to be, and I'm putting some Tamiya flat white over it. Some people might have concerns about the fact that the flat white is not as shiny and lustery as the lacquer pure white that I was using. But I think for as many coats as we're going to have of lacquer on top of that, it's probably not going to be an issue. Yes, I'm just very carefully touching spots up, trying to get the best results I can get. Pretty sure this is where I just called it done. It's kind of a tightrope walk. You get to a spot and you say, yeah, it could look better, but am I gonna fix it till it breaks? So that's gonna do it for this portion of the build. Here's a nice pretty picture of the set that this model kit came out of. I got this from Cult TV Man, and last time I'd meant to give Steve Iverson of Cult TV Man a shout out for working miracles and getting that kit to me before I needed it. Once again, help us get to 100 subs before the end of the year. It would really help us to grow the channel. And in the meantime, happy modeling.